In July of 2022, a team of archaeologists digging through more than 5 feet of compacted sediment at the San Lazaro rock shelter, just outside the Spanish city of Segovia, uncovered a stone that immediately struck everyone on site as wrong. Not damaged, not unusual in the typical archaeological sense, just wrong in a way none of them could initially articulate. It was an oblong granite pebble roughly 20 centimeters long, smooth from centuries in a riverbed, and it bore 3 shallow natural cavities arranged in a pattern that made the whole team stop what they were doing and stare. Study co-author Maria de Andrés Herrero, a professor of prehistory at Madrid's Complutense University, later described the moment with disarming simplicity, recalling that she and her students looked at the stone and, almost in unison, said it looked like a face. Sitting directly in the center of that accidental face, exactly where a nose would be, was a small, faint, reddish dot. Nobody thought much of it at first. It looked like nothing more than a natural mineral stain, the kind of thing archaeologists walk past by the thousands on any given excavation. But this particular dot, sitting on this particular stone, buried in a layer of sediment associated with unmistakably Neanderthal stone tools, would eventually be handed over not to another archaeologist for further study, but to Spain's National Police Forensic Division, the same specialized unit responsible for solving modern homicides and burglaries. And when those forensic scientists finished their analysis, they confirmed something that upended one of the most persistent assumptions in the entire study of human evolution. The red dot was not a mineral stain. It was a fingerprint. It belonged to a Neanderthal. And it was deliberately, intentionally placed exactly where a nose belongs on a face, roughly 43,000 years ago, making it, according to the researchers who studied it, the oldest complete human fingerprint ever discovered anywhere on Earth. To understand why archaeologists needed actual crime scene forensics to solve a 43,000-year-old mystery, you first have to understand just how unusual this particular stone was compared to everything else typically found at a Paleolithic excavation site. Most artifacts recovered from Neanderthal. Occupation layers are exactly what you would expect from a hunting and gathering society. Stone tools shaped for cutting, scraping, or piercing, animal bones bearing butchery marks, the physical residue of daily survival. This pebble had none of that utilitarian purpose. It showed no signs of having been used as a tool, no wear patterns consistent with cutting or scraping, nothing to suggest it served any practical function whatsoever. Geological analysis indicated the stone had originated in the nearby Eresma River, roughly 5 kilometers from the rock shelter where it was ultimately found, meaning someone, at some point roughly 43,000 years ago, had picked this specific stone up from a riverbed and deliberately carried it more than 3 miles to the shelter where Neanderthal families were living. That alone told researchers something important. Nobody accidentally transports a non-functional rock. 5 kilometers. Someone chose this stone, specifically, and carried it with them for a reason. The team, led by archaeologist David Alvarez Alonso, began systematically ruling out mundane explanations for the red mark before allowing themselves to consider anything more dramatic. The first and most obvious question was whether the reddish dot was simply a natural mineral inclusion within the granite itself, a common enough occurrence in certain rock formations that would require no human explanation at all. Using scanning electron microscopy alongside multispectral imaging technology, techniques capable of analyzing the chemical composition of a surface far more precisely than the naked eye ever could, researchers determined the red pigment was iron oxide. More commonly known as ochre, a mineral pigment that Neanderthals across Europe are already well documented to have collected, processed, and used to decorate objects, and quite possibly their own bodies. That finding ruled out a simple natural mineral stain and confirmed the mark had been deliberately applied using material Neanderthals were already known to actively seek out and use. But confirming the mark was ochre still left researchers with an enormous and far more difficult question. Was this red dot actually a fingerprint left by a Neanderthal hand, or was it simply an accidental smudge? Embedded within that small mark, invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable once properly imaged, were 13 distinct identifying dermatoglyphic features, the technical term for the ridge patterns, unique to every individual human fingertip, including specific ridge endings and ridge bifurcations, exactly the kind of granular forensic detail a modern detective would use to match a print. Found at a crime scene to a specific suspect in a database, the individual ridges measured roughly 48 millimeters apart, a spacing pattern forensic analysts determined was most consistent with the right index finger of an adult male. The forensic team's involvement served a second, equally important purpose beyond simply confirming the mark was a genuine fingerprint. It allowed researchers to definitively rule out modern contamination, verifying beyond doubt that the print did not belong to any archaeologist, student, or conservator who had handled the stone since its excavation. a critical and often underappreciated step in ancient forensic analysis, since modern researchers handling delicate artifacts can easily and accidentally leave behind their own fingerprints during excavation, cleaning, or study. With the pigment confirmed as intentionally applied ochre and the mark itself confirmed as a genuine human fingerprint, uncontaminated by modern handling, researchers turn to the final and most provocative question the entire study would ultimately hinge on. Was the placement of that fingerprint sitting precisely at the spot where a nose belongs, relative to the pebble's two other natural cavities resembling eyes, purely coincidental, or did it represent a deliberate act? A Neanderthal individual recognizing a face-like pattern in a natural stone and consciously choosing to complete that resemblance by adding a single, precisely placed mark. This phenomenon, the human tendency to perceive faces and other meaningful patterns in random or ambiguous natural stimuli, is well documented in modern psychology under the term pareidolia, the same basic cognitive quirk responsible for people seeing a face on the surface of the moon or in the grain pattern of a wooden door. To rigorously test whether the fingerprint's placement was too precise to be coincidental, researchers turned to statistical modeling running Monte Carlo simulations, a computational technique that generates thousands of randomized scenarios to calculate the probability of a given outcome occurring purely by chance. The results were striking. According to the study's statistical analysis, there was only a 31% probability that the ochre dot's precise alignment with the stone's natural nose-like indentation occurred randomly. In plain terms, the placement was almost certainly deliberate, reinforcing the researchers' conclusion that whoever pressed their ochre-stained finger onto that pebble, roughly 43,000 years ago, was not making an accidental mark. They were completing a face. The implications of that conclusion reach directly into one of the oldest and most contentious debates in the entire field of human evolutionary research, the question of whether Neanderthals, the stocky, heavy-browed cousins of modern Homo sapiens, who dominated Europe and parts of Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing roughly 40,000 years ago, were genuinely capable of symbolic thought, abstract representation, and something resembling art, or whether they were fundamentally more limited cognitively than the modern humans who eventually replaced them across the continent. For most of the 20th century, the scientific and popular consensus leaned heavily toward the latter view, portraying Neanderthals as brutish, purely practical survivalists, incapable of the kind of abstract symbolic thinking that produced cave paintings, carved figurines, and personal ornamentation among early Homo sapiens populations. That consensus has been eroding steadily over the past 2 decades, chipped away piece by piece by an accumulating body of physical evidence, and the San Lazzaro fingerprint represents one of the most direct, most personal, and most difficult to dismiss pieces of evidence yet presented in that ongoing debate. As the study's authors themselves put it, the pebble represents the oldest known non-utilitarian object bearing a fingerprint discovered anywhere in Europe, a description carefully chosen to emphasize that this object served no practical purpose whatsoever, existing purely, as far as researchers can determine, as a deliberate act of symbolic representation. This discovery does not stand alone. It arrives as the latest addition to a genuinely substantial and rapidly growing body of evidence that has been steadily rewriting scientific understanding of Neanderthal cognitive capacity over the past 15 years. In southeastern Spain, at a site called Cueva de los Aviones, researchers have documented perforated marine shells dating back roughly 115,000 years. Shells that appear to have been deliberately pierced and coated with pigment, almost certainly worn as personal jewelry, produced by Neanderthal populations tens of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived in Europe to potentially influence or teach them such behavior. Deep inside Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France, researchers discovered something even more startling. A series of deliberately constructed rings built from broken stalagmites, arranged in a structured circular pattern deep within total cave darkness, dated to an almost incomprehensible 176 to 500 years old. A construction project requiring coordinated group effort, artificial lighting to navigate the cave's interior, and some form of shared intentional purpose that researchers still debate today. And in the Loire Valley of France, at a site called La Roche-Cotard, researchers identified deliberate, spatially organized engravings carved directly into a cave wall, sealed off from any possible later access by naturally accumulated sediment more than 57,000 years ago, well before modern humans arrived anywhere near that specific region. Engravings that current evidence attributes exclusively to Neanderthal creators based on the stone tool technology found alongside them. Each of these discoveries, individually, chipped away at the old assumption of Neanderthal cognitive inferiority. Together, alongside the sand, Lazzaro fingerprint They paint a picture of a species increasingly difficult to distinguish from modern humans in terms of raw, symbolic, and artistic capacity, whatever real differences may have separated the two populations in other respects. The San Lazaro rock shelter itself carries particular scientific weight within this broader story, because of exactly when, geographically and chronologically, this fingerprint was left behind. The site sits along the Eresma River Valley in central Spain, and the archaeological layer in which the marked pebble was discovered has been associated with unmistakably Mousterian stone tool technology, the specific tool-making tradition exclusively linked to Neanderthal populations, rather than modern humans. Crucially, the Iberian Peninsula, the geographic region covering modern Spain and Portugal, is recognized by researchers as one of the very last European refugia where Neanderthal populations survived, clinging to existence in isolated pockets, even as modern humans steadily expanded across the rest of the continent, and Neanderthal populations collapsed and disappeared almost everywhere else. That means this particular fingerprint, dated to roughly 43,000 years ago, was left behind by one of the final generations of Neanderthals to ever exist anywhere on Earth. Individuals living in the literal twilight years of their entire species, shortly before Neanderthals vanished from the fossil and archaeological record entirely. There is something genuinely striking, almost unbearably poignant, about the idea that one of the very last physical, deliberate creative acts by an entire vanishing human lineage happened to survive intact into the present day, preserved by nothing more than a smear of iron-rich pigment and roughly 5 feet of accumulated sediment, waiting more than 40,000 years to be uncovered by a team of archaeologists who, by their own account, initially thought they were simply looking at an oddly shaped rock. That question of exactly what was happening to Neanderthal populations in their final millennia has itself become the subject of genuinely cutting-edge genetic research. France, including a newly sequenced high-quality genome from a 45,000-year-old individual found at Goyet Cave in Belgium, only the 5th such detailed Neanderthal genome ever successfully produced by researchers anywhere. The genetic picture that emerged from this research adds an entirely new layer of scientific texture to the same final chapter of Neanderthal history that the San Lazaro fingerprint belongs to. Unlike Neanderthal populations previously studied from Siberia's remote Altai region, who showed clear genetic evidence of repeated inbreeding among close relatives, a signal of small, isolated, genetically struggling populations, the northwestern European Neanderthals studied in this newer research displayed no such signs of close relative mating. Instead, researchers found that Neanderthals from Belgium and France were more closely genetically related to one another than to other contemporaneous Neanderthal populations, scattered elsewhere across Europe, pointing to the existence of a distinct, regionally connected Neanderthal population in the far west of the continent, one that nonetheless maintained broader genetic and, quite possibly, cultural connections, stretching across much wider distances. Taken together with the San Lazaro discovery, this genetic research paints an increasingly detailed portrait of exactly what kind of population was capable of producing something like a deliberately placed fingerprint on a face-shaped stone, not a scattered handful of cognitively limited survivors clinging to existence in isolated pockets, but genuinely interconnected regional communities maintaining social and genetic ties across considerable distances right up until the final chapters of their species' long existence in Europe. The tools used to actually extract and interpret this kind of evidence, whether genetic material recovered from ancient bone or dermatoglyphic ridge patterns preserved in 43,000-year-old ochre, have themselves been transformed by the same broader wave of computational and artificial intelligence advances, reshaping nearly every corner of modern science. Forensic fingerprint analysis, the exact discipline the Spanish National Police Forensic Division applied to the San Lazaro pebble, has increasingly come to rely on machine learning models trained to detect and classify ridge patterns, minutia points, and other identifying dermatoglyphic features with a level of speed, consistency, and pattern recognition sensitivity that traditional manual analysis, however skilled, simply cannot match working purely by eye. Similar computational advances have transformed ancient DNA research over roughly the same period, with modern sequencing technology and increasingly sophisticated bioinformatic algorithms now capable of reconstructing usable genetic information from degraded genetic material that would have been considered completely unrecoverable by researchers working even a decade earlier. Applied together, this expanding forensic and genetic toolkit means researchers studying deep human prehistory are no longer limited to interpreting stone tools and skeletal remains in isolation. They can increasingly cross-reference physical, forensic evidence like the San Lazaro fingerprint against detailed genetic reconstructions of the same regional Neanderthal population, building a far richer, far more textured picture of exactly who these final European Neanderthals were, not merely as an abstract, vanished category of extinct hominin, but as genetically traceable communities capable of individual, deliberate, symbolically meaningful acts of creativity. The researchers gave their unusual pebble an affectionate, thoroughly modern nickname once the significance of the find became clear, calling it Perico, a playful homage to Pedro Delgado, the Spanish professional cyclist who won the 1988 Tour de France, a nickname that captures something genuinely charming about how a team of serious academic researchers related to this small stone once they understood what it represented. And the comparison to a modern crime scene investigation, which might initially sound like little more than a clever marketing angle for a scientific press release, actually reflects something scientifically substantive about how rigorously this particular claim needed to be tested before publication. Extraordinary claims in paleoanthropology, particularly claims involving Neanderthal symbolic behavior, have historically faced intense scientific scrutiny and skepticism, precisely because the stakes of the underlying question, whether an entire extinct human species possessed genuine capacity for abstract symbolic thought, are so significant to our broader understanding of what actually makes modern humans cognitively distinct, if anything, from our closest evolutionary relatives. By enlisting actual criminal forensic scientists, rather than relying purely on traditional archaeological interpretation, the San Lazaro research team built their case using an entirely independent line of scientific verification, one specifically designed within modern forensic science to withstand exactly the kind of rigorous cross-examination a courtroom trial would demand, applying that same standard of evidentiary certainty to a 43,000-year-old cold case with no living witnesses and no surviving suspect to interview. It is worth noting that the San Lazaro fingerprint, while described by researchers as the oldest complete human fingerprint ever discovered, is not quite the very first fingerprint evidence ever associated with ancient hominins. Researchers have pointed to an earlier, considerably more fragmentary print discovered decades earlier at a site called Königsauer in Germany, unearthed back in 1963 and potentially older than the Spanish discovery, but that German find represents only a partial impression, lacking the kind of complete, richly detailed ridge pattern that allowed Spanish forensic analysts to extract 13 distinct identifying features and confidently assign the print to a specific sex and likely age category. That distinction matters enormously for what researchers can actually conclude from each piece of evidence. A partial, incomplete print can confirm that a hominin hand touched a particular surface at some point in the deep past, but it cannot support the kind of detailed forensic analysis capable of determining whether that individual was young or old, male or female, or whether the mark itself represented a deliberate, purposeful act, rather than an incidental brush of a hand against clay or stone. The San Lazaro print's completeness is precisely what allowed it to support such a specific, well-supported conclusion that an adult male Neanderthal deliberately, intentionally pressed his ochre-covered right index finger onto a stone he had personally carried more than 3 miles from a riverbed, positioning that single mark with enough precision that modern statistical analysis considers pure coincidence a near statistical impossibility. This entire body of evidence also sits inside a much larger genetic story that has reshaped how scientists think about the actual relationship between Neanderthals and the modern humans who eventually replaced them across Europe. A relationship that turns out to have been far more intimate than a simple story of one species, outcompeting and displacing another. Genetic sequencing of modern human populations has repeatedly confirmed that nearly everyone alive today, whose ancestry traces outside sub-Saharan Africa, carries measurable amounts of Neanderthal DNA, typically somewhere between 1 and 2% of their total genome. The direct genetic legacy of interbreeding events between Neanderthal and early modern human populations that occurred repeatedly across tens of thousands of years of shared occupation of the same landscapes. Some of those inherited genetic fragments continue to actively influence modern human biology today, affecting everything from immune system function to skin pigmentation to sleep patterns, a genuinely strange kind of biological inheritance passed down from a species that otherwise vanished from the fossil record roughly 40,000 years ago. Framed against that backdrop, the San Lazaro fingerprint stops looking like evidence from some entirely alien, cognitively separate branch of the human family tree, and instead reads as direct physical testimony from close biological relatives, individuals who, whatever behavioral or cognitive differences ultimately separated them from the modern humans spreading across the same continent, were capable of exactly the same fundamental impulse that drives a huge share of human artistic behavior even today, looking at something ambiguous, recognizing a face within it, and reaching out to make that resemblance complete. What ultimately makes this discovery so effective at capturing public imagination, beyond the genuine scientific rigor underlying it, is how deeply personal and immediate it feels compared to almost any other category of archaeological evidence available to researchers studying deep human prehistory. Stone tools tell us what a population was capable of doing. Animal bones tell us what a population ate. Even skeletal remains, however emotionally resonant, primarily tell us about biology, about how a person lived, what they ate, and ultimately how they died. A fingerprint is different. It captures something closer to a single, fleeting, deliberate moment of individual human intention. One specific Neanderthal, on one specific day, roughly 43,000 years ago, picking up a stone that happened to look like a face, deciding that face was somehow incomplete, dipping a finger into red ochre pigment and pressing it down in precisely the right spot to finish what nature had only partially suggested. As study co-author and geologist Andres Diaz Herrero described the moment of realization during the research process, seeing that perfect fingerprint sitting exactly where a nose should have been on that ancient stone was, in his own words, simply amazing. 43,000 years later, using imaging technology originally developed to catch modern murderers and burglars, a team of Spanish scientists reached back across one of the deepest gulfs in the entire human story and confirmed, beyond reasonable statistical doubt, that a member of an entirely different, now extinct species of human once looked at a rock, saw a face looking back, and reached out to make it whole. The broader scientific debate this single fingerprint reignited shows no sign of settling quickly, and researchers studying Neanderthal cognition remain genuinely divided over exactly how much weight any single artifact, however compelling, should carry in resolving a question this fundamental to how humanity understands its own evolutionary story. Skeptics within the field have long cautioned against overinterpreting isolated finds, noting that a single marked pebble, however statistically improbable its alignment, cannot by itself prove that Neanderthals possessed a fully modern capacity for symbolic thought comparable to early Homo sapiens, and that genuine scientific certainty on a question this significant will require continued accumulation of independently verified evidence from multiple sites across multiple regions, rather than reliance on any one dramatic discovery. The San Lazaro research team themselves have been careful, within their published academic paper, to frame their conclusions with appropriate scientific caution, presenting the statistical improbability of random placement as strong supportive evidence for deliberate symbolic intent, rather than as definitive, unassailable proof beyond any possible alternative explanation. But taken together with the shell jewelry at Cueva de los Aviones, the deliberately constructed stalagmite rings at Bruniquel Cave, the sealed engravings at La Roche-Cotard, and now the detailed genetic portrait of a genuinely interconnected regional Neanderthal population in France and Belgium, the San Lazaro fingerprint adds one more, unusually personal data point to a body of evidence that has been steadily